attend in-person City Council meetings in council chambers on the lower level of City Hall. Public access to tonight's meeting is also available on the Local Government Access Channel 8 for Comcast subscribers, on the city's YouTube channel online, and by telephone using the call-in numbers posted on the meeting agenda. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Leidy?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Luke Manharamasa will be absent. Councilmember Burns? Here. Councilmember Jaramillo?
Here.
Councilmember Kondo?
Here.
Councilmember Roper?
Here.
Councilmember Goff?
Here.
Councilmember Nowicki?
Here.
Councilmember Walker?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have 2 items for our study session tonight. The first one is the Civic Center Visioning Phase 3, work session number 2. Director of Planning and Development, Brooke Svoboda, is here to introduce this item. Welcome.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm just going to tee it up here real quick. We've got the MIG team, EPS team here today. We're going to talk about the mechanical pieces of this process today, about what it looks like for us to create a vision for this project. We've got a couple development scenarios we're going to walk through. I want to just mention that I think our goal here is really just to sort of refine your feedback. I don't know that we're going to come back with a consensus on this is what it's going to be. That's not what we're trying to do tonight. But what we do want to make sure is that we're setting that realistic expectation and trying to formulate and identify what a council expectation is for this visioning process moving forward. And then following that, we'll talk about next steps and how and what's going to be involved after we get through those details. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jay Rinkins from MIG. Thanks.
Great. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Council. Jay Rinkins with MIG. I'm joined tonight by, 3 of my colleagues. Participating in the presentation with me will be Matt with EPS. He can tell you a little bit more about his firm when he starts. But I mentioned in our last presentation that we had a partner working on some of the market economics and things like that. So that's Matt and his team. And then Mary from MIG as well, who's an engineer, and we'll be talking about the utilities on the site as well. So just really quickly. So we're going to go through that in that order. Market analysis. So it's hard to kind of understand what does the market look like right now, have some of that discussion about kind of the local kind of market versus the regional market, and what we could expect on the site based on its visibility, its location, some of the other development nearby, demographics and that sort of thing. The infrastructure capacity, so thinking about water, stormwater, sewer, telecommunications, and what does that tell us about the site, what could it support, and what might require additional investment potentially. And then finally wrap it up with some development scenarios. So you won't hear from me for a little while unless I can help with any of the Q&A, but I think what we'll do is pause after each one of these sections, and so that you can ask questions and have some conversation. So Matt, you're up first.
Thanks, Jay. Good evening, Council. I'm Matt Prosser. I'm a principal with Economic and Planning Systems. We're a land use economics firm. I'm based in our Denver office, and I've been supporting MIG on this effort. I'm going to walk you through the findings of our market analysis to help support the development of the scenarios you're going to see later tonight. And so I'll present our material, and then happy to take questions when I'm done. So first, we're going to talk about demographic and market conditions, and then get into sort of what our estimates are demand are, and what the takeaways are from those estimates. So really, there are a few questions that we're answering in this portion of the study, and it's really looking at what are the uses that are in demand in North Glen, and how does that relate to potential uses we could try to attract to the Civic Center campus. And how do those different uses align with the vision that you all have and the community has for the site? After we've identified some scenarios and a path forward, we're going to do some feasibility testing to understand, how market feasible these uses are, where we might need to use different tools to support potential development of the site. But that is for a later phase. So first, I'll talk about sort of market conditions that we're seeing. And so what we did first was develop a trade area. And really what the purpose of a trade area is to sort of define the area where the majority of sales or activity or competition for uses at the Civic Center site would come from. And really based on the location of the site being sort of somewhat off a major arterial, the existing presence of major anchor uses, especially retail uses along the I-25 corridor, and where a lot of the growth has occurred along in the sort of North Metro area in the recent past. We really think that this site has the potential more sort of neighborhood-oriented uses, especially from a retail perspective. And so we drew a trade area that sort of reflected what a traditional sort of neighborhood-oriented trade area would be, which is usually around 2 miles in a radius size. We obviously take into account major, physical barriers and transportation barriers when we develop these trade areas. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't get a regionally oriented use, but it's more likely that the types of retail uses and businesses that will want to locate here are more trying to capture visitors and sales from folks that live nearby. And so this trade area is really to help us understand what the strength of the market conditions are for potential uses within the Civic Center site. And so we looked at growth and population households within the trade area, compared that to the city's totals as well as the metro area. Really just sort of pointing out here that there has been growth in the trade area in the recent past, the last 10, 15 years, about 4,000 new households built, but at a slower rate than the metro area is growing. And North Glen has really captured even a smaller portion of that growth. But as we get into it, you'll start to see that that's likely starting to change. But historically, one thing that sort of we use to sort of pen future estimates to is North Glen capturing about 10% of this North Metro trade area's growth over the last 10, 15 years. We looked at demographic trends from looking at age, income, race, those sort of things to factor in potentials. One thing that jumped out to us is really the shifting changes in age groups. So this compares the percent of residents in the trade area in 2010 by age cohort compared to 2024, and we also did that for North Glen. Two things that really jump out here are, obviously we have an increasing number of senior residents. That's sort of what we would expect to see. But the more notable thing is the increase in the number of residents that are 20 to 44. And so those two cohorts together. And that represents a sort of a larger share of the increase in population that's occurred in the trade area. And to us, indicates new entrants into the market. So whether those are new home buyers or new renters, but a changing of some of the demographic makeup of this pretty well-established trade area. We also looked at incomes to assess sort of the strength of the market, consumer demand and potential within the trade area. The trade area's median household income was about $85,000. North Glen's median is just slightly lower, about the same, but sort of North Glen and the trade area have very similar conditions and are starting to increase in terms of its strength relative to the metro area. From there, we started to dive into specific trends specific to different uses. So first, I'm talking about multifamily. So this is primarily apartment development that's occurred in the trade area. So over the last 15 years, the trade area has grown by about 250 apartment units or multifamily units per year, growing at a pretty strong rate of 1.8% annually. So there has been some substantial growth of new rental units within the trade area. Obviously, North Glen, as you know, has only captured a really sort of a small portion of that over the last 15 years. But again, we're going to talk about in the next slide here that's starting to change. You all have a couple of a handful of new projects that are either about to be opened, just opened, or are under construction, and that'll substantially change sort of the capture that's occurred in North Glen. This slide shows the number of new units added to the trade area over the last 10, 15 years. You can start to see an increasing number of units being built over the last 5 to 7 years. And really, we're seeing that huge influx of new units that are coming online this year and next. And so there'll be a period of absorption, 2 or 3 years, to where those units will have to be leased up, and we'll have to assess how these new units into the market are really impacting the economics. And I really think it'll be an interesting test case to see where Northglenn and the new units coming in really set the market going forward. Also on here is vacancy rates. Obviously, it shows a 10% vacancy rate in the trade area now. That's relatively high, but that's because there's a lot of new units on the market, and so it would be expected as we're absorbing those units. So when we started looking at rents, what we're seeing is that the trade area average rental rate per unit is actually caught up to the metro area average. And like I had mentioned, with these new products coming online, specifically some of the ones that are trying to perhaps capture above that sort of above market lease rates, we might see that even grow even more. And likely Northglenn's average rate will jump as a result as well. And so we're really at a point to where these new units really show what the market is in this area going forward. We looked at for sale residential trends too. So this is really single family homes and attached townhome units, about 100 units per year over the last 9 years or so. So I mentioned we were doing about 250 multifamily apartment units, and this is about 100 for sale units. The average sales prices have increased pretty substantially over the last 10 years. The average sale price is about $585,000 for a new products in the trade area. And the mixture is really becoming to be more heavily attached oriented. So there's more attached townhome units being built than perhaps single family units. And that shows up in sort of the new sales by type as you look at the trends over the last 10, 11 years. Sort of an even mix in previous years, but really starting to show more of those attached products. And similar to the multifamily story, we have a large increase of for sale units that are in Northglenn that are shown here. The Carl's Farm project makes up a substantial portion of that 22 and 23 units on here. And those sales prices, especially for the attached townhomes, have really increased substantially. You can see a closing of that gap between the detached units and the townhomes or attached units, and really sort of similar price points, almost with a little market premium for that detached unit. And this is, to us, indicating pretty strong demand for this type of housing in the area. We also looked at market conditions for retail, office, and hotel, getting the, what are the potentials for some of those uses. The office market, as you may know, nationally in the U.S. is in a great deal of flux. We are doing some work in the I-25 corridor down in Centennial, and it's really sort of eye-opening, some of the shifts and changes that we're seeing there. And I think the story there is there's really not much demand for office anywhere unless you're in a very prime location like Cherry Creek, for instance. And a lot of that demand is coming from users shifting from older, more outdated office spaces in other locations. And so this site is likely not a candidate for office. The only types of office that I think might be potential would be ones that are sort of service office oriented. So dentists, a real estate agent office, which are more, in our minds, sort of service commercial uses as opposed to sort of a traditional office. We also looked at retail trends. There hasn't been a lot of growth in the recent past in the retail inventory. And what it's somewhat expected for this sort of a mature market. What we're seeing is new entrants, new businesses, new retail businesses coming into the trade area are taking older spaces or reformatted spaces, starting to shift and address needs of the shifting demographics. And so the inventory is not really changing much, and what you're seeing more is sort of a shift in the types of businesses and how they orient to the folks that are in the trade area. We also look at hospitality and the same sort of thing. We've seen some new hotel properties come into the trade area, but they're also replacing ones that have gone out of business or are outmoded and being shifted to other uses. So not a lot of change in the inventory. And we also have some data on sort of retail absorption, and it changes relatively or declining vacancy rate, which is starting to indicate to demand, as well as fairly strong absorption. So what I'm kind of reiterating the point is there are new businesses coming in, but they're kind of replacing sort of outmoded businesses or ones that were in the market previously. Retail rents are still lower in the trade area than the metro-wide average, as well as in Northglenn. So that's a concern about potential demand going forward. And this map shows new retail spaces that were built in the last 10 years. And, a lot of that new brick and mortar space is really built along the 36 corridor. Stuff that's along 120th, 104th is more sort of that rehab or reformatting of existing centers and spaces. So we took all of those market trends and data points and started to develop some estimates for demand and some takeaways to help guide the MIG team in developing the scenarios you'll see later. So as I mentioned, in terms of residential demand, there's been about 350 units built per year in the trade area. About a third for sale, 2/3 for rent. Historically, Northglenn has captured about 10 to 15% of that housing growth, although that capture rate is likely going to increase with all the new product that's coming online. So if we look at that same sort of rate of growth for the trade area over the next 10 years, there's potential for 3,500 new units in 10 years. If we captured even 10 to 30% of that, that's 350 to 1,000 units. In Northglenn. And so it's reasonable to assume that the Civic Center site could capture a significant share of this demand. And so housing uses are definitely uses that could be attracted to the site, and ones that are likely lead in terms of market strength and helping drive feasibility of projects. And so we have some considerations in terms of the types of products that I'll talk about in a minute. In terms of commercial demand, in our minds, there's really two areas that demand will come from. First is attracting sales from the residents in the trade area that are occurring elsewhere. So folks are leaving our trade area to make purchases or go out to dinner at places that are outside our trade area. So are there ways that we can get them to come back with something unique that doesn't exist in our trade area? Or can we attract sales from all these new residents moving into the new multifamily units or the new for sale units that are being built around our campus? And so those are the two kind of locations where potential demand will likely come from. So we did a fancy, I'll call it fancy, modeling of potential demand from existing residents and comparing where they shop to the sales that occur in our trade area. And really sort of the big picture is we looked at all of these different store categories that are in this table to trying to find different store categories that might have sales that are what we call leaking outside the trade area. So occurring somewhere else further away that we might be able to capture back. And really what our analysis found is there aren't any real specific categories where that leakage is significant, where that we could really, target this specific retailer and say, hey, you need to come in here because there's potential that's not being met. And so what that tells us is that a lot of the demand is likely going to come from new residents as opposed from recapturing sales. So when it comes to potential related to recapture, I think the potentials are related to new businesses that are new, are sort of unique to our trade area. They don't exist elsewhere. They're offering a service or a product or an experience that doesn't currently exist in our trade area. And so when we think about potential retail uses or commercial uses, what are ways we can create sort of a unique environment or a unique experience here at the Civic Center that might attract businesses that want to locate here? So we also estimated demand from new residents coming in over the next 10 years and what we think the potential capture of retail space and commercial space might be from those new residents that are going to live in the trade area. And our estimate is that the Civic Center is probably able to capture less than 25,000 square feet. So not a ton of retail demand that is likely from new residents at the site. And so when we think about a retail component, within the plan for the Civic Center area is how can we be intentional and targeted about those limited opportunities and specific tenants or business types that we might try to attract that can help create vitality and vibrancy in the area. So our takeaways in terms of residential demand, it's well positioned. The site is well positioned to capture both for sale and for rent products. I think, like I said, a lot of the new products coming online will help us really gauge the market strength, especially for rental units, and that'll tell us a little bit more about financial feasibility. Right now, we would think that an apartment building is likely going to have to be surface parked. We're not quite to the point where we can support structured parking likely without some financial incentives or support for a project. But as those products come online, maybe that picture changes. But for now, that's sort of what we're thinking. We need to park in sort of a traditional format that we're seeing elsewhere in the trade area. And what you'll hear in a minute from the rest of the MIG team is that the capacity, especially from a residential perspective, is going to be more limited from utilities and other constraints than likely from the market demand. And so we think a residential is a strong use. It's likely what a potential developer will lead with in terms of driving a feasible product. And there's a couple different formats that'll work, but we can't quite get to a very dense product yet. In terms of commercial takeaways, limited demand for the site. We're thinking more that small, locally oriented retail options that provide sort of a unique draw. And maybe the potential for a destination restaurant. Given the I-25 exposure, there are some examples on the South I-25 corridor of sort of larger restaurants, destinations, say a View House is an example of one that's, provides a little bit larger sort of anchor restaurant, if you will. And also that is a unique model in that it provides even some gathering or event space that they rent out as well. And so that could be something to explore as a potential use in the site. So I just gave a ton of data and information to you, and so hopefully it wasn't too much like drinking out a fire hose, and I'm happy to take questions at this time.
Thank you. Councilmember Jaramillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciate your presentation and all the information you provided us. I agree, vitality and I agree that we have to make this a destination. And you explain that with restaurants. I can envision like a food market, which is, have a few layers of, few stories of food markets, which resemble like, from my experience, I just went to Avanti in Boulder and loved it. Loved the experience. Saw the Buffs beat Oklahoma State by 52 points, so that was a good time. But you saw generations of people. You saw strollers in there. You saw college kids in there. You saw millennials. You saw baby boomers. It was the place to be. And I feel like that's something that we could possibly bring here, especially being in prime location, I-25, 120th. And so I can envision like a rooftop, having people there celebrating, all times of the year, be a destination for, and also be a draw. Like, we got to work together with our hotel that we have there. We have the Delta Marriott. Like, that's awesome. Like that would be like such a great draw, I feel. And I feel like that's something that North Glen could really capitalize on. And, it's food and beverage. It could be, a bakery on the bottom, pizzeria, whatever. Everything that everybody wants here on the dais, in 3 or 4 stories, and have a wonderful view of the Rocky Mountains to the west. I think that's what I envisioned, because I was there in Boulder, and I've been there in Denver too, and I said, man, North Glen would be a great place. It could be, whatever we decide to call it. I just think that it's going to be a awesome draw. I know when people come into Colorado from the north, from Wyoming, they say like when they get into town, they feel like 120th is when they get into town for Denver. And I feel like a lot of people feel comfortable here. It's a destination, but having a place where we could really have something that is a destination. That's what I'm looking for. I don't want it to be just like, just housing and stuff. It's got to be a year-round thing, or it's always going to be awesome, for a lack of words. But let me look at my notes real quick, see if I've missed anything. But yeah, I think we have the destination there, and we can do that. But if you haven't been to Avanti, they have one in Denver, have one in Boulder, maybe they have one in Vail.
Yeah, I've been.
Why not
yeah.
North Glen? Let's do it. All right, I digress. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to that, a couple considerations about that idea are two things. Is finding an operator that someone kind of shares that vision would be a challenge for a potential developer. And so that'll be something that, will be the biggest thing. Because usually those work when you can find an operator who's able to manage that space and then manage all of those different vendors within. And so that soliciting input or seeking development partners that have connections to that might be a way to try to get that. The other thing I would consider is you do have the Webster Lake Promenade just to the north that has a mixture of some of those quick casual restaurant things. I know more nationally oriented chains, and perhaps this would be more locally oriented, but what the potential for sort of cannibalizing sales from that is, and how an Avanti-esque development is somewhat different than what is already just to the north, just the potential concerns. But yeah. Yep.
Councilmember Kondo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I wonder if I could just go back to some of your assumptions in your analysis. And it's kind of a series of questions. I hope you'll indulge me. So the first of which is, going back to your trade area definition, it seems a little bit strange that you're just defining it by major artery streets. I come from a marketing background, and I was thinking that when you define an area of potential catchment of customers, you do a radius circle. I wonder if you can explain why you're not doing the radius circle thing.
Yeah, the approach to use streets more is kind of more fine-tune a radius. We usually start sort of with a radius and then kind of fine-tune that based off of either if there's like rivers or major sort of physical and mental barriers. So the potential roadways that, where to the previous comment, when you reach a certain road, you feel like you're in a different portion of town, or there is a trade-off in terms of the distance of traveling west further than going east for retail. And so that was sort of a way that we helped sort of gauge to the west more of that competition to the east. It's just sort of where the edge of the development is at this point. And north-south, sort of similar considerations.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So roughly what radius circle does that
It's
equate to?
about 2 miles, and that's typical for a sort of neighborhood-oriented retail center, and that's how we sort of assess that. If we were looking at a use like, a Target or a Costco or a Walmart, you start to get more regional oriented, or a department store, and that starts to get more at a 5 mile or even bigger for certain uses. But if you look at the I-25 corridor, a lot of those regional anchors or uses are already located in certain locations that are, would capture this trade area. And then when we did the leakage analysis, you sort of confirmed that as well, is that there isn't a lot of misrepresented store categories, especially in those more sort of large anchor uses, as well as the site's not necessarily big enough or oriented right on 120th for some of those. And so when we think of more of a destination, we need to think of uses that would, one, want that visibility in I-25, and two, would be a good fit for the site. And that's sort of where we kind of landed on potential of a food and beverage option that would be a more destination orientation, as opposed to, say, a larger format retailer.
So that begs the next question, which is, when you did this analysis, did you have an entering assumption like, yes, we think that this is going to be a neighborhood serving or regional serving? Did you kind of have that preconceived notion in advance of going into that? Or is this what the data that you just showed us kind of led us to conclude on?
Yeah, no, our analysis usually starts with understanding first what the site attributes are. And so where we are on major roadways, exposure to those roadways, then starting to think of where people live around there. And then the next consideration are what are the major competitive retail or commercial areas, and how does this site compare to those? And that are sort of the three considerations where we start to think, does it make sense to hone in on a certain orientation? And so I don't think we went in saying that we can't do X, Y, and Z, more sort of just starting with what are those attributes that the market's going to look for, and how do those match up with the orientation for various uses?
Because, it sounds like to me that when you talk about neighborhood serving, sort of oriented retail or experiential, and my esteemed colleague here to my right, Councilmember Yaramillo, talked about Avanti. I mean, where does Avanti fit in terms of kind of being a destination, experiential destination? Are they going to be more attractive to a neighborhood serving sort of format or a regional serving format?
So that type of use, I think, has a potential to look at both markets. At the end of the day, those type of uses do have to rely on a fairly dense, localized neighborhood trade area of people that are going to come regularly, as well as being supported by more of destination users. And so you need a little bit of both. And so this site, we were really wanting to understand what the potentials are in terms of the folks that live pretty close, and then what additional potential does being on I-25 and having some visibility present.
Because I think you have a chicken and the egg sort of problem here, and respectfully, but I mean, when you did your analysis, did you think about the types of housing that we're going to be building here? I mean, if it's affordable, or if it's or if it's going to be market rate housing, it's going to really depend on the people that are going to be moving in and living here, and what their financial or fiscal demographic is.
Yeah.
That drives the kinds of retailers that will want to be here, right?
Right. And I mean, one thing we look at first, and that's why I led with it, is really the change in households and the demographics there. And so first we're looking for change. Retailers, whether it's small or large, they're first going to see if there's new people living, because that represents new potential people. If there isn't a lot of change in the households in a trade area or in a localized area, they're going to assume that their needs are already met by existing businesses, especially in an established area like this. And so new housing, new rooftops to them potentially indicates demand. And then you look at the types of products and uses that are coming in. And so as you saw with sort of the for sale housing that's coming in, that's rising price points. We're at or above sort of metro-wide average for home sales there in terms of price point. What we're seeing from the multifamily, especially the newer ones coming in, is that we're getting to the market average in terms of rental rates, and perhaps these new units will even exceed those. And so those are considerations, as well as that change in the demographic age. I think my perceived notion would be there's a lot more growth in the seniors, and there was some, but there also is growth in that sort of younger demographic, which potentially indicates that there will be market demand for newer, sort of more even urban uses that you might see in the core of downtown. I think a potential strategy for a developer would be to think about sort of chainlets. So, local businesses that exist, say, in Denver or Boulder, that are branching into their second, third location. And this is the type of site that might be sort of might be an attractive location for those. It's unique, kind of, local in that it's from Colorado, but it's maybe not the first site that they create. It's sort of a business model that they've already shown elsewhere.
Understand. Yeah, certainly the senior population with fixed income perhaps maybe don't have a large, sizable disposable income as opposed to
some of
working
that apartment
professionals.
growth is 55 plus oriented, and so that what did factor in as well. So yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. I yield the floor.
So thank you for this. I know I still have my mic on. Thank you. this is just the beginning, right, of your presentation. And I just wanted to go back and highlight the 2 takeaway slides, because all the slides before that are a ton of research, right?
Yep.
We hired you to do the market study. You did an excellent job. However, we may not love the results.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they're wrong. So you did a great job. You pulled together the information. And while we may have a different vision, we know that we also don't want to create something that is not feasible, that's going to stand empty, that's going to cause us detriment as a city in the future.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, and I look at the takeaways, knowing that we have more to come, more to hear from. The one thing I wanted to speak on was, you had mentioned possibly something like the View House. I instantly thought of the property on 104th and Federal that is about that size, that continues to struggle and is currently empty. And so that seems proximity-ish.
Yep. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I know we're closer to I-25, but I don't want to have something like that.
Right.
That's that sizable that sits empty. So I'm looking at the recommendations and the takeaways that you have so far, right? Commercial demand is limited. We're looking at housing. We might be able to get some small local shops in there. And then I don't know about that destination restaurant, because you're right, we have a section of that just north of this site. So thank you for that. I want to make sure, Councilmember Roper, I don't want to forget you at home. Are you good? Give me a thumbs up. Okay. Councilmember Kondo, you have more to add?
Yes, Madam Mayor. Thank you for that anecdote that you just provided. You know, when you talk about chainlets, another anecdote, for example, at the Webster Lake Promenade, you had Tzatzikis. If I'm just totally botching the pronunciation of that Greek restaurant, but they had, I think, 2 or 3 restaurants here in the Denver metro area, and they just closed.
Oh, yeah.
So to me, that's kind of a head scratcher. Even in an established retail area, a restaurant is struggling to attract the right amount of customers to be able to stay open. So, you know, that is my chief concern. I hope you kind of got that in my line of questioning, is we need to make sure that we get it right. Because I certainly don't want to make an epic mistake, kind of like Broomfield did with the First Center.
Right.
I mean, I'm just watching them, and I feel sorry for them, because somehow or another, their economic analysis failed them, and now they're stuck with demolishing a multi-million-dollar building. And we're a smaller city. We're not Broomfield. We can't make that mistake.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Before you move on to the second part of this, I need to call for a short recess.
Oh.
So if council could meet me in the executive session room, we're going to be back in a few minutes. So Brandon, if you could do a short recess for me, I would appreciate it.
I think that people get really excited when they see the maps, but I promise you there's some interesting things about the infrastructure on site that will kind of play a role with the opportunities on site. So kind of the big question we want to talk about when it comes to infrastructure is, what are the limitations to the future of the site? We can kind of break that down into a few categories. We have our wet utilities, such as sanitary sewer, storm, and then water. And then we also have other utilities like power and communications on the site. When it comes to the sanitary sewer, the main things that we'll have to take into account are how much sewage can really be conveyed in the pipes, and then also what's going on downstream. So what's going on after the sanitary sewer water leaves our site, where is it going, and how is that infrastructure, what is its capability? So next, after that, we'll kind of get into storm. Again, we'll kind of look at the physical pipe conveyance aspect of it, and then also the on-site storage, which we do have a pond on site, which is great. And then we'll get into the potable water aspect. That will also kind of depend on the pipes and what they're able to physically convey. And then a big part of that discussion will be the fire requirements. Lastly, power and communications, these tend to rarely be the limiting factor. However, it's really important to always make sure that you're kind of communicating utilities and getting those in the plans as soon as possible. So to get into the sewer, basically we've got two big mains that leave the site. One that leaves the site to the north, one that leaves the site to the south. The one that leaves to the north ends up going to a lift station F, and we do know that there are some constraints at that lift station. Based on a study done in 2019, lift station F was kind of measured to be acting at almost capacity, and so we know that this is pretty limited, and we don't want to increase the water we're sending to that lift station, and that's going to be kind of an important consideration moving forward. The South Main, however, there are no known capacity considerations with the lift station downstream, which is lift station A. So we're mostly limited by what we can physically fit in the pipe leaving the site, according to North Glen, requirements, of course. So from our initial calculations, we think that this is going to be probably the trickiest utility and likely to be the limiting out of the utilities I mentioned. So to give you kind of idea, let's look back at 2022, the site plan, and kind of break down what that north and south area looks like. So that tiny red area in the last site plan was the only area that flowed to the north. It was a pretty small area. And then that green area was the area that could gravity flow into the South Main. So why that's important, I'm kind of separating those, is that that blue area cannot gravity flow into that Southern Main. And so for the 2022 site plan, they ended up designing that with force mains and a lift station on site, which basically means you just got to pump up the water just to get it uphill a little bit, and then it can kind of join that green section and flow off site. So to put some kind of numbers to this, the blue and green area has kind of a estimated capacity. So the maximum amount on site that we could send down this pipe is about 130 gallons per minute. And that's a peak hour value using a peaking factor of 3. Then if we were to look at that red area, the max capacity, which is due to the limitations at the lift station, is only 5 gallons per minute. And that number is way less, obviously, than what we can send to the south. And the reason for that is, like I said, in 2019, they found that where that lift station F downstream is basically acting at capacity. So we don't want to increase what we're sending to that lift station and overload it. So what that 5 gallons per minute is actually representing the old recreation center and the amount that used to flow from there. So what that means is, I kind of want to point out here is that blue area, that is going to be a bit more expensive. We tend to design sewer systems that they're gravity fed, and that is, there's plenty of benefits from a maintenance aspect as well as a cost aspect. However, it is not uncommon to add a force main into a system at a small on-site lift station. So it is something that's doable, but there will be a cost aspect to that. So something that I just want to point out is that, There may be an increased cost on site, but there's also the potential that if the city is considering doing something to lift Station F and increasing that capacity, we could potentially increase that 5 gallons per minute to 85 gallons per minute and potentially reduce any need for any force mains or lift stations on site. So just something to keep in mind, and I think a discussion that's kind of important to have as we move forward. So on to the easier utilities, kind of the key takeaways from the storm infrastructure on site. The existing stormwater pond is pretty well sized. It kind of basically, the last study of the pond looked at using 95% impervious cover. So sidewalks, asphalt, any kind of like hard surfaces like that. So 90% of the land use would be a hard surface like that. That's really high value, and I think it's very viable for us to be under that with our development, especially the north side of the site. So we're thinking that we're on a pretty good track. We're not likely to need any changes to that pond. Our pipes on site do need to convey the 100-year storm. We're pretty well sized on the southern side of the site since that's a bit more developed. However, on the northern side of the site, we have some smaller pipes. It is likely we'll need to upsize those as well as adjust the alignment for the future design. So to move on to water, key takeaways is that water really needs to be coordinated with the local fire district. From this initial calculations, because we don't have enough details to really get into the nitty-gritty of it, what we are looking at is what we can find from the IFC, which is the International Fire Code, which does provide a pretty good resource and allows us to be able to do some estimates about what we expect will be needed for fire flow. The reason why fire flow is so important is that when we look at the kind of the demand that we need for water, how much water we need to provide to the site, it is like 80% of it is going to be this fire flow. The demand that people need to wash their hands and, what a restaurant needs to cook or, any type of use like that is actually much less than typically than what is needed for fire suppression. So it tends to be the driving factor in this case. From initial review, it does not seem that water is going to be limiting on site. Like I said, I think that sewer is really going to be more of the limiting utility on site. And, as mentioned, we do have a pretty well set up infrastructure, especially with that memorial and those mains along there. However, on the north site where it is less developed, it is likely that we'll need new infrastructure to connect any new users. And then finally, power and communications. The key takeaways here is we're not quite at a point where we can really do those calculations yet. And like I said, it doesn't tend to be a limiting factor in our experience. However, I think that once we start getting into the alternatives and getting into a design, it is always important to kind of loop providers in just in case they have any feedback and make sure it's coordinated from an early part in the project. So, a little bit cut off there, but this is just kind of an overview table just to give you guys kind of an overview of what I said. Kind of on the left there is the available capacity, kind of already mentioned that. On the right there is kind of an overview of some of that infrastructure that I had mentioned that we're kind of thinking is likely to be required. Kind of wanted to give you an idea on this slide of what those numbers mean in perspective of uses. So in that middle column we have there, the equivalent units, you can kind of see if we were to take that north sewer area and that 5 gallons per minute of available capacity and turn it straight into townhomes, it's about 10 townhomes or 14 apartments or some commercial development. And so just kind of give you an idea of kind of what those numbers mean in perspective. The one thing that I do want to note is that these sewer values are based off a North Glen study that was done based off of metered values here. So it is a really great use source, especially for our residential. However, I think depending on what that commercial use ends up being, these calculations will need to be fine-tuned, and it is likely that that number may decrease if we, go with higher commercial uses like restaurants or if you guys wanted to put a car wash, that would really change things. But just to give you an idea, this is just kind of an initial, to give you kind of that gut check feeling of what those numbers mean. So I give you a pretty good overview of the sewer from the storm. I think as long as we kind of keep under that 95% impervious, we're in really good shape. To give you an idea of what that 2022 site plan had, they calculated 90% impervious for their design. So it is very likely that we're going to be under that 95% value, which is pretty typical. Then lastly, kind of that water demand, this is a very, I would say, conservative calculation, and we're at 900 residential units. So if you kind of compare that to the sewer values above, that is why I'm kind of leaning towards, I think sewer is going to be the limiting utility on site. And so that is all I've got for you, the quick overview of the utilities on site. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have a few. Councilmember Goff?
Thank you, Mayor. So my question is on slide, I don't know, either 37 or 38, where you had the map with the green and blue and red. So my question is just, because of course this is like technical and confusing probably to a lot of people. But so what you're talking about is if we do something to increase the capacity for sewer drainage from the red area, would that then also include the blue? Because you said something about having to do something for the blue area.
Yeah, no, happy to clarify. So basically, so what the red encompasses is actually 10 townhomes, which were included in the 2022 plan. So those 10 townhomes are going to flow into that north sewer, leave the site, and then after it leaves the site, it's going to go to that lift station F. So that lift station F is where we're constrained. So I'm saying if there is interest and the city is interested in doing it and increasing the capacity at lift station F, that blue area could potentially, instead of having to be this force main pressurized system, could actually gravity flow and kind of the red would grow to encompass that area.
Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Councilmember Kondo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Dr. Goff, for asking that question, because I was just trying to visualize, and where is lift station F? Where does that sit relative to this diagram?
I feel like
It's at 120th and Community Center Drive.
there we go.
It's in the
120,
parking lot
okay.
of the Metro office building, North Metro office.
Gotcha. So we're talking about upgrading that lift station. So would this be on the order of cost, say, for example, like the Force Main A lift station upgrade, or is it too early to really put a dollar?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it's a little too early. I think the essence, the takeaway from this conversation is that based on the density that was previously provided in the 22 vision and what we can do, can you jump back to that table real quick? That the density that we're talking about with just the south sewer capacity to accommodate the north half is a higher density than what was contemplated in that 22 vision. So just for perspective. So I think regardless of what happens with F, in my mind, it's a question of, is there enough density to bring a developer to the table with what we're looking at with this versus what's the appetite for council in terms of the type of density and what makes it feel comfortable in terms of space that's placemaking.
Thank you. And I see Director Borges is in the room, and so hopefully you can set me straight if I say something wrong. But my understanding is the capacity of the city's sewer system right now is roughly around 85%. And once it reaches a certain threshold, I think it's like 90%, we're supposed to develop plans to increase our sewer system capacity. So is that also part of this analysis when you're talking about adding retail and residential? Are we now buying ourselves potentially the cost of increasing the capacity of our sewer plant processing rate or volume?
No, thank you for that question, and thank you for thinking the next steps down the road. So this is really focused just on the community center area. I am happy to say that we just had our re-rating approved by the CDPHE. So our wastewater plant capacity has been increased. So that 80%, that's the plant capacity, not the pipes in the ground. So this is part of the overarching master plan associated with that. But we do still have other upgrades that are going to be necessary moving forward that I think we've talked about before I was here. Yep.
Gotcha. As they always say, well, I won't say that, but it does roll downhill. Yeah, I'm finally learning that when I got into this position. And then finally, last statement, I represent the city on North Metro Fire Rescue District, so I don't know if you need to have a point of contact or you need to talk with North Metro to get the actual stipulations or requirements on water supply. I'm more than happy to make that connection for you.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that as we kind of start to fine tune the uses and that kind of thing, that'll be kind of one of the next steps. So that'd be great. Thank you.
Gotcha, thank you.
And those are all the questions we have for right now.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Aren't you glad you didn't have to listen to me the entire night? So this brings us to our initial draft development scenarios. And I just want to caveat these and let you know that what we try to do is think about some of these major opportunities and constraints on the site, try to think about some of the things that had come up in prior conversations, and really, you know, sort of weighted our last conversation about a month ago, most in that. And what we've done is put together they're basically four options. They're numbered 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. But there's 4 options. And it's meant to really look at a variety of sort of pieces here. One being the parking layout and quantity. We know that that has been an issue on the site already with some of the new uses, the attractiveness of the rec center, the theater, now City Hall being a great facility that is getting more use. And so wanting to think about what does that look like and what are some varied approaches to the parking. Second, the circulation, thinking about how people move through the site. How are they going to get in the site, off of Community Center Drive, move around. Building orientation. So are we creating, you know, a building-lined street? Are we taking advantage of different adjacencies that we have, whether that be Webster Lake Promenade, the I-25 frontage, thinking about Webster Lake itself, E.B. Rains Park and the lake, as well as the beautiful Civic buildings that have now been built on the campus. And then the land use program. So thinking about the housing mix, this idea of sort of destination retail and locally serving retail. As I think Brooke mentioned during the intro, we're not expecting that you're going to say, "Oh, I love 1 or 3 or 2B." Like, frankly, I think they have all the pros and cons right now, and I think what we want to hear is what are the pieces that you like and don't like about each, and then we'll take that information along with the work that we've been doing on the utilities, the market analysis, and some of the other work to come up with a preferred scenario to present to you all, and then you'll still have opportunities to kind of wrestle with that too. So, scenario 1. Here we're sort of we've named these, we could have named them a bunch of different ways, but we've named them based on the parking, which is kind of a funny way to do it, but I think it's an easy way to differentiate them. So rec center adjacent lots. So in this particular scenario, one of the major drivers was thinking about how do we get the most parking closest to the recreation center and the theater. So you can see that there's a large parking lot basically where the old City Hall is, between where we are sitting and the theater. Along with a large retail space. That could be broken into multiple retail frontages. It could be one retailer. On the north side then, yeah, this thing doesn't work, does it? On the north side of Memorial Parkway, what we're showing is live-work units in the purple, fronting the parkway. With some multifamily residential either behind that or attached to it, and then townhomes to the north portion of the site. The townhomes in all of these different scenarios are assumed to self-park, meaning that they have garages integrated into them. And so they would use some on-street parking for visitors and that sort of thing. But as far as the actual tenants or owners potentially of those sites, they would park within the structures. And then you can see we've included an L-shaped, if you look at the white line, kind of an additional access coming in off of Community Center Drive, going between the multifamily and the townhomes, and then kind of connecting down into that frontage road right in front of the rec center, senior center, and theater. And then based on we didn't really get a chance to talk about it last time, but based on the last work that we did with you all, or with the council that was in place in 2022, which some of you were a part of, we do know that the kind of that pedestrian experience, that walkability was really critical. And so just at a very high level right now, showing in those green arrows, where we do some enhanced pedestrian connections, probably multi-use pathways with landscaping along them. Some of those along roadways, some of those actually, next to or through parking lots as well. So that's scenario 1. And scenario 2A is large surface lots. So here we've really aggregated the lots, but tried to sort of shield them from view, so to speak. This is a strategy that's done a lot of times in surface parked places or developments, where you're trying to create a pedestrian environment that does have that sort of more traditional feel with buildings close to or next to the sidewalk, and maybe it's 2-3 stories of development adjacent to that. So here we actually have some development, residential development, on the south side of Memorial Parkway. Those would be townhomes in this particular scenario, but that has a large surface parking lot behind it. Some of that, of course, could be designated for visitor parking, but as we said, those townhomes would be self-parked. So most of that parking could be used by City Hall and the theater and rec center. Then going to the north, we have multifamily residential on the west side of that north side of the Memorial Parkway, some live-work units north of the Veterans Memorial. And then here, kind of a unique take is retail along the community center drive frontage. That does a couple of different things. It actually puts the retail closest to where the traffic naturally is, the highest of the site. If you kind of count community center drive, the highest traffic is going to be on community center drive itself. It also puts it adjacent to Webster Lake Promenade. And gives you some frontage to the park, which could attract some unique retailers, we think, as well. So that's a kind of a unique aspect of this one as well. And then going, I guess, ringing, if you will, this larger surface parking to the north with another 150, 180 spaces up there. We have additional townhomes. The variation on this, which isn't all that different with scenario 2B, but the variation is if you were to do the 2-story parking deck on the south parking area where the old City Hall is sitting now, that would free up additional development space and or create more parking for the rec center, for City Hall, than the theater. So we've actually shown most of that additional parking being allocated to the civic uses and only increased the townhome development by a small degree, probably 4 or 5 units. That could be reallocated to increase the density of housing on the site, which as we dig deeper into this, maybe coming out of our conversation this evening, we may want to consider because of the higher cost associated with structured parking. We may be interested in a larger yield to help offset some of that cost if we don't want to put as much public funding into that. The third option, or fourth, scenario 3, we'll say, is disperse small lots. So here, the idea is to not have a lot of exposed surface parking. Most of it is tucked behind buildings. Conceptually, we're doing that with multifamily development to the north. Something as we move further through this would be making sure that there's enough parking, of course, to support that multifamily. And so playing with the height of the buildings and how many floors you're doing, making sure that that's right sized to the number of parking spaces will be key. But we have townhome development along Memorial Parkway on the north side. The retail in this particular scenario is actually on the west part of the site, taking advantage of the I-25 exposure. For that northern retail that's shown. And then the 4,000 square foot retail would be kind of the smaller, unique inline shops that could perhaps benefit from that shared parking with the larger retail space. And then we have the live work spaces on the south of Memorial Parkway in this scenario as well. So with live work, I sort of just glossed right over that. One of the appeals of that in the previous work that we've been involved in with you all is that it provides that flexibility where maybe the market is, isn't super strong and supportive of a lot of retail in the near term, but if we create something that's a flexible product that maybe functions as purely residential out of the gate, maybe a few years down the road, maybe it's 10 years down the road, but that market has changed. We have a lot of people shopping locally. Those retailers may have actually transitioned once during that period, those initial retailers, and it may actually be a much more attractive market. And so you could potentially create some ground floor retail type spaces within the live work. So that is an appeal to the live work product, is that it may not be live work immediately. You can do some things to ensure that it is, or that a portion of those are, but likely not retail. I think I shared with you the example in downtown Superior where they're doing the live work spaces, and they had leased, at least a few months ago, they had leased, I think, 2 were occupied, another one, a lease was signed. And they were working with those tenants to sort of mandate a minimum number of hours for the retail spaces. So many days a week, so many hours. So there is, as I said, there's mechanisms to ensure that you have some active ground floor uses within those. But I think the better benefit is that there's that flexibility over time. So I know that was relatively quick, shorter than the other presentations, but I figured we had a lot to talk about on these. So love to dive into it with you all.
Great. One thing I love is that you can find something positive about every scenario. You can spin them all quite well. I had a clarifying question before we start.
Yeah.
Not only for us, but for anyone watching. Can you give us the difference between commercial and retail?
Yeah. I mean, retail is actually a subcategory of commercial, technically. So we were focused on the retail based on the market analysis. So when we were showing retail, or when we're showing commercial on here, we're really thinking about a retail component. So restaurant or retail.
Okay. So I guess just to use this one as an example, there's a large building. Is that designed to be one retail, or is it designed to be a space that may house multiple?
It could go either way. What we were sort of thinking of as we were sort of drawing this one out is that the space to the north was one. It was sort of representing that potential destination restaurant concept.
Okay.
And then the space to the south could be retail frontages, but that could be, doesn't mean it has to be soft goods. It likely would not be. It would likely be the coffee shop, the ice cream shop. Maybe it's 2-3 storefronts.
Okay. And then if you could speak to, because tonight is not the first night, some sort of, I don't know what you call Avante or Stanley Marketplace. What do you call that? Like a
Food halls?
food hall, maybe?
Yeah.
But some of them are food halls with retail. So Avante does not, but the Stanley Marketplace has shops and food.
Yeah.
That was discussed a couple years ago.
Yes.
Can you speak to that as a possibility, or what is that called? Is that called mixed
Matthew,
use?
man.
No, I know you spoke to it already, but what I'm saying, I
hear
don't
from
want you
that
to
guy.
repeat yourself. Again, if we look at scenario 3, is that something that goes in that red commercial square, or no?
Could it go in the red commercial square?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. We're using some of
But
these
we
terms.
conceive of it. So what we're showing on these is actually the square footages are the building footprints.
Yes.
So that could be a 2-story building that's 22,000 square feet, which could support a small food hall.
Got it. Okay. I'm not saying that's what I want. I'm just
Yeah.
asking that question.
That
'cause
could be
it does-
accommodated
It
within
does
the
seem to come up a
scenarios.
lot. Okay. I just wanted that clarification before we get started.
I want the wet blanket.
Councilmember Burns.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you so much for putting so much thought into this. I'm personally very excited for the U-shaped road and more entrances in.
I didn't even touch on that in this.
I love it. And I love the thoughtfulness you put into the pedestrian walkways, like especially like leading to our other center that already has, like walkability. So it's like, oh, I went to kickboxing and now I'm walking over here to do something. I see the value and like the mayor said, like you can spin, there's positives to all of them, but there really are. Like I was initially drawn to scenario 2A. Just because it makes more sense to have the retail along the road. But I can also see value as like a future like basketball tournament mom, the value of having that big space like right outside the rec center, or if it's like dinner and a show, that sort of thing. I can see the usage. I know we're not deciding that, but I think this is really thoughtful and very cool, and it is like I see the walkability. I like see everything we talked about in all three of these. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for incorporating those live work spaces. That's like all the rage right now. I'm reading. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing up the road. We did. I guess we couldn't help ourselves. We brought back the. For lack of a better term, the parkway idea with the road on both sides. So this would sort of, although the existing Memorial Parkway can support the ingress and egress, the traffic that would be projected even in this scenario, just that sort of idea of creating the additional road on the north side of the parkway is something that we included in this. It wouldn't be dependent on that, having that built, but we did include it in this scenario.
Councilmember Nowicki.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for this presentation and for all the research that has gone into this. And I found the scenarios really neat to look at. I want to talk a little bit about parking. So how is parking calculated? And take, for example, well, actually, let me just have you answer that question first, and then I'll go on.
Yeah, so at this point, what we've done is just allocated space to parking and then calculated the number of parking spaces that could fit within that. So it's basically about 350 square feet per space. And so within those spaces, well, that's where I was going with dialing in the eventual program. These are all within the realm of possibility in terms of the amount of parking necessary to support the uses. But on this one, for instance, if you were to go a full 5 stories, which is a whole nother discussion that we can have. But if we went to full 5 stories, which would be kind of the limit of stick built, probably pushing the market right now, you'd probably need a little more parking than what's shown. So we'd have to, adjust for that. So those are the things that we'll have to dial in moving forward.
Yeah, because I'm curious about that, especially with townhomes. I mean, pretty much everybody drives. I think more people drive now since the pandemic. And I know, again, parking is always kind of an issue in that area. So that is a concern of mine. And I guess going back to the kind of the 5 stories, and we had talked about this previously, and kind of from the gist I'm getting, it sounds like the more kind of residences, the better in some ways, as far as like market conditions, or am I way off there?
I mean, in terms of having a user base on site to support the businesses, yes, the more people, the better.
Right.
I would ask Matt to chime in quickly on, and I know you don't want to really hear from him again.
No, that's great. I absolutely do. Thank you.
But as far as the number of units that we're talking about, in my estimation, is not like, oh, now you can build this instead of this. But Matt, if you can speak to that. So the difference if you were to go 3 stories versus like 5 stories.
Well, I think it would be more attractive to a potential developer if you could get more units on site, if you're able to park it without a parking structure. And so there's that sort of fine line I think the MIG team's trying to draw of there's enough parking space allocated to be able to park these in a surface configuration. The townhomes, I will mention, would likely have parking like the ground floor would be a garage and an entryway, and then above would be the living spaces. And so there's more flexibility perhaps for accommodating that parking within the building footprint as opposed to a detached parking space or surface lot. But when we get to those multifamily stacked units, that's when you're seeing these bigger sort of surface parking lots.
Does it change the picture a lot for like number of restaurants you could do or supporting different types of uses?
No, I don't think it substantially changes the demand if you do 300 versus 400 or something. You want enough people that there's some vitality and people there at a lot of different hours, but there isn't a magic number of you have to have 350 units for the retail to work.
All right, Brooke's getting up, so.
I want to rephrase your question.
Sure.
Because I think I know what you're asking.
Yeah.
Does the residential density dictate the commercial uses?
Yes.
And I think the answer is not necessarily, because we're talking about the trade area and what's happening in the trade area, that changing the types of density or the residential use isn't going to necessarily influence or steer what commercial can go on the site as it relates to market, other than parking. So, because the one thing that Matt just touched on was what the developer preference was, which is a different distinction between parking to uses ratio, which is a MIG thing. So, but to your question is, and I think Rich, you were kind of alluding to this earlier, which is, what do we need to have on the site to make the site successful? Right. And for commercials aspect, we're not looking at the site to drive the commercial uses. We're looking at the trade area to drive the commercial uses.
Okay.
So theoretically, if we have higher end residential product on the site, that's a higher socioeconomic number that has a higher density in the proximal area. That could be a factor, but it's not going to be a deciding or limiting factor per se.
Okay.
Is that a fair statement? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Real quick, I just want to talk about, because again, I kind of like different things from different scenarios, so I kind of tell you what I like and don't like.
Please.
For the record.
Do you want to start at the first one?
Sure. Yeah. So scenario one, I like the walkability piece of it. And I like, when we look at the focal point intersection, I like where the focal point intersection is. I don't really like the focal point intersection being close to the rec center. I think that given the activity there, that concerns me. So I like it further out.
That makes sense.
And I think that the red building right there, that space is kind of growing on me as far as the commercial aspect. So, I think this is probably my favorite scenario for a lot of those reasons. And I just want to say 21,000 square feet, that would be perfect for medieval nights. We could have medieval nights every night.
Nice.
So the staff would be looking at it every day. So, no, I'm just kidding about that. Scenario two, I do like the commercial kind of along the parkway, but I think I like this one less than number one. And again, this has the focal point. See where the focal point is. Yeah, I like it more toward the city hall there. Yeah, and going back to scenario one, I do like that it has the large space near the commercial and, again, Parsons Theater, the rec center, things like that. Again, if people were to kind of go there and eat and kind of go see a show or something, there would, a lot of the time there would be more parking for everyone as well. So, yeah, I think I just talked myself into scenario one. So, but yeah, I like the layout. I like the green space, the way it's kind of laid out. So yeah, those are my
Were there
thoughts.
any redeeming qualities to 2 or 3?
Let's see. Well, the parking lot piece, again, the parking piece it sounds like, like calculus to me right now. So I'll have to understand that a little more.
To be honest, I would say scenario 2 probably has
2A or B?
too much parking. Both, actually. They have a lot of parking. So it would really help with those critical times at the rec center,
Right.
senior center, theater.
We're not going to hear complaints if there's too much parking.
I know. That's why I put it in air quotes.
Yeah, right. But I also hate to like see just a sea of like parking,
Yeah.
you know. So again, I'd have to understand more about the parking needs. I do like the idea of having more kind of the live, just living north of Memorial Parkway, kind of in scenario one, where you have kind of all the residential piece. You have a little bit of the live work right along that walkway. I like that. I think that's cool. But for the most part, you have primarily all the living space north of that.
Okay.
You know, whereas that little commercial block, again, that could be divided up into multiple little spaces, you know, and I'd also want to hear from city staff how they would feel, you know, staring at a commercial place or a townhome or, you know, a 5-story building, something along those, you know. So, but I guess at some point we would get community feedback about those things, so. Yeah, so I know that was kind of train of thought. I'm sorry?
I was just going to say, in our next stage, we'll do massing models and things too.
Oh, great.
So you can see heights and kind of viewpoints from the street and that sort of thing.
That would be
too.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of my train of thought. I like the way scenario one flows as far as kind of the live work and as far as just the roads and the greenway and the walkway. I think it offers kind of a nice balance. Or I'm sorry, scenario one.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just paging through to see if it jogged your memory at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Councilmember Goff.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I think probably my favorite scenario is one, and it's for something that, I mean, I'm sad to say is also very small, and that's the park green space. It's got the most. So I don't want a sea of pavement. I like the parking lots broken up a little bit better. So a lot of the things that my council member adjacent here mentioned is I agree with. I don't think, I mean, we've heard a lot of complaints about parking, and I think a lot of that is relieved once the, major construction is done. So I really don't think that is this huge issue that we have to have this huge, orient everything around a big parking lot. But it should be adjacent to the theater and the rec center because that's where people use it. A question I have, and maybe that's coming down the pike, is nowadays people are cramming as many family members as they can into their little living space. And so there's more than 2 cars per apartment anymore. So have you given any thought to, could it potentially be a problem that people are parking, up by the theater and then walking to their apartment and going to bed at night and taking up that parking space? Do we have some idea about how to manage that, or could that be a problem?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. We see that in all sorts of scenarios, urban and suburban, honestly, where, you create, maybe it's a 1-car garage and the driveway is only large enough to have 1 space, but there's 3 or 4 cars, right, for that household. Mm-hmm. And so definitely consideration, particularly when you're thinking about townhome development, right? So there's not going to be a lot of space between those unless we do alley loaded, which we can consider too. I think that's probably worthwhile. Mm-hmm. In this particular scenario, we were showing some visitor parking or additional parking associated with those townhomes even. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something we can continue to look at, keeping that in mind, that just because they have a garage doesn't mean that all those cars are going to fit in the garage.
Right.
The other thing I'd point out is in all scenarios, we're assuming that any new internal drives, and especially roadways that we're creating, would have on-street parking as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I'd rather have the parking spaces broken up, so scenario 1 has that, and the walkability there is good, it has the most green space. One question I had is, I know we don't have the problem that my family in Illinois does with, so much water all the time, but they do permeable pavers, a lot of times they're required, and doesn't that help with water absorption in the ground for flood? I don't know if that's an option that people do out here at all. Is that something we might consider?
Has Northland looked at pervious paving?
So So under our UDO that we adopted back in 2019, we actually have what we call LID requirements where developers can actually use that type of mitigation strategies, and they get incentives for doing that because it's more environmentally sustainable and friendly. So we actually have that already in our UDO. And I think when we did the original master planning exercise, we actually identified those things as opportunities, especially when we're talking about pervious pavement and parking lots for water quality, doing planter or median planters that help absorb and do water quality management that way too.
Yeah, all of that is good, so great, thank you. Let me just check my notes. Yeah, I guess that's probably it. So, I mean, they all do have advantages. I'm not a big fan of like the 400 plus parking spaces. I don't know that we need that many extra. And I like having things broken up a little bit more and more green space.
Great. That's good feedback. Thank you.
Councilmember Roper from Home.
Hi, guys. Thank you. So I appreciate your presentation. This was very nicely put together. I do appreciate that. And as the mayor said, there is something positive that we can find with each one. I may be the dissenting voice here, but definitely I do worry about the 5-story projections for housing. I think that puts an undue need on our parking, sewer, infrastructure, police, medical services, traffic. And again, when we talked earlier, we didn't want to have a cookie cutter look. We have already places in our city that have big apartment complexes. I don't feel like we need that unless that is our end goal. When we think about, I would encourage council when we think about what we love about our city, Deza Estates, Northwest Open Space, EB Rains, Webster Lake, St. Stephen's Lutheran Church, those are all unique, really individualized and authentic places, and I don't think we can create that by just building a 5-story apartment building. That won't allow us to keep that authenticity, and it won't be bespoke enough to represent who we really are. So again, I do like the different proposals. I don't like the multi-layers of housing. I think that would just as many of my council members have said, I don't want to see a sea of parking or a sea of apartment buildings that could potentially just sit empty as well. So I think we need to think about what is our end goal. I'm not interested in us selling our soul to the apartment complexes just for the sake of doing that. I want us to keep the authenticity about what we have here at North Glen.
Thank you.
Councilmember Kondo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I too am conflicted. I kind of have similar sentiments as Councilmember Roper, which leads me to ask the question, how do you look at sight lines, and how does that play in establishing where you put the focal point mark?
I mean, at this point, we're really, in the original master plan, I prioritized Memorial Parkway as the major sightline that was being prioritized, and put the recreation center, senior center, theater. Actually, I think you may have noticed, it was actually in the reverse configuration with the theater at the terminus of Memorial Parkway, recreation center actually to the south, but giving that facility the western view. And so really that maintaining that east-west connection to the park, connecting the memorials, the EB Rains Memorial, the Veterans Memorial, and then the Civic facility at its terminus with now the City Hall where it is. That was the important connection. The other, I think, view termini, what we're kind of thinking about is from a pedestrian perspective, what's pulling you through the space? What is that experience? Are you walking along a surface parking lot? Are you walking along front stoops of townhomes perhaps? Is it a apartment building, like was just mentioned, and I think we all have seen apartment building ground floors that have been designed pretty well, and then some that are really not, and you may as well be walking along a surface parking lot. So really we're thinking about that, and then the creation of, as Brooke was mentioning, maybe he didn't mention, but one of those LID sort of interventions are bioswales, landscaping, right? And so thinking about that from that pedestrian experience. But as far as, can we see through the site to something, it's that east-west connection that was already established and we want to respect and maintain.
Because here's, and, I hope you'll indulge me here. I'm just trying to, in my mind, in a 3D space, especially the vertical, trying to visualize this. So say, for example, scenario one, I'm assuming the yellow townhomes are 5 stories. I'm also assuming.
Yellow townhomes would be 3 to 4 stories tops.
Okay. Then the multifamily residential, is that a 5-story structure?
Well, we assumed, so in all of these, we assumed 5 stories, and there was really a way to test, does the site capacity physically exceed what the utility capacity is? And what we basically determined is that no. In all of these scenarios, we're under that utility capacity. So basically we can do the upgrades to move the water to the south versus having to upgrade the entire lift station.
Okay. And then the live work, is that only on the first floor only, or is there live work on above first
The
floor?
work would be usually a 2 or 3 story product, and the workspace would be on the ground floor.
Understand. Okay, so it is kind of your workspace and then people living on the second floor. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping me visualize that. When I look at scenario one, I have a flashback of living in Japan, and where, in high density, they just built one building after another tall buildings, like dominoes. I like one for various reasons, like, say, for example, what Councilmember Nowicki talked about. But I'm just thinking to myself, if I were to reside there in one of those townhomes, especially if it's not one that's facing E.B. Rains or facing towards the west, I'm just going to have a beautiful view of my neighbor in that building. So that's where I struggle, because what Councilmember Roper talked about is, one of the things that's so important about our city is the vistas. And are we not honoring or respecting that treasure, if you will, with scenario one? Same thing would go with, obviously, the multifamily residential.
Yeah.
I do like, however, what Councilmember Nowicki talked about, putting the commercial in somewhat across the parking lot, away across from the D.L. Parsons Theater, because, people go and eat and see a show and then eat. So that's kind of my gut visceral reaction when I look at scenario one. I do like the scenario two in terms of the fact that it has, hopefully I'm looking at the right slide here, yes I am. This one has more of all the buildings on the periphery, but then the other thing that I'm concerned about is if I reside in, again, the townhomes, I'm closer to Interstate 25, and that has a lot of road noise. And I'm sure we all appreciate the road noise from Interstate 25, not? So, in that particular instance, I'm thinking to myself, well, if, I had my magic wand or pixie dust, I would prefer to have the residences closer to E.B. Rains Park. The other thing that I like about scenario two is the option value of where you have this space where if in the future we need more parking, we could potentially add a second layer, have a multi-story. So, again, I'm not settling on any one particular scenario. I'm just kind of telling you the things that I like as we scroll through all 3 scenarios.
Yeah. May I respond to your comment about the first scenario?
Yes.
So I agree with you about sort of the views. I think the western and eastern townhome buildings would be the most desirable. And we debated putting in a bunch of precedent photos, like examples of other places, and tried to keep it simple, and particularly considering how many slides you had to sit through before this. So we did not, but there are great examples of creating really nice kind of multi-use pathways with maybe, whether they're flower gardens or vegetable gardens, those sorts of things, on sort of that green axis, north-south axis. where those actually become pretty desirable front doors. In this particular scenario, the multifamily, would potentially open up on that, and we'd want active uses there as well as the townhome. So, but I hear your points about the views, proximity to the highway, thinking about how do we leverage best and activate and respect the park all at the same time, and then making sure that there's no, undesirable spot, or, yes, there's going to be some spots that are more desirable and less desirable, but can we avoid having, particularly residences, that are, the kind of leftovers that no one wants to live in? I think those are all really great points.
I just remember my aunt living in one of the inside buildings, and it was a nice view of the opposite building, but this is in Japan. Perhaps maybe, and like I said, I'm no architect, but looking at scenario one, maybe you swap the L and the J and you flip them so that you have maybe more of a central parking space, between the two multifamily residential. With some option in the future, right? So one of the things that I saw at National League of Cities in Atlanta was this whole thing about activation of public spaces. And so maybe what you do is, yes, maybe you do have a parking lot, but maybe there's times that you block that from use of parking, and you activate that as a temporary, on a temporal basis, say a Christmas market. The better block sort of concept. So that's one of the things that kind of floated in my head.
We designed parking lots that purposefully double as a plaza space that can be activated. So they have utility hookups, drainage, a little higher quality surfacing.
Yes. And then my last concern is, when we look at high density living, unfortunately, in some of our areas in North Glen, that tends to be an area where there's higher incidences of run-ins with the law. So as you're doing this design, are you consulting with public safety to kind of make sure, we're not creating spaces where maybe lawlessness could happen?
We definitely consider SEPTED principles.
Yes, SEPTED.
Yeah,
Thank you
crime
for that.
prevention through environmental design in our work, but we definitely will collaborate with police as we move forward with a preferred concept.
Okay.
We'd love to do that.
Gotcha, thank you.
Councilmember Walker?
Thank you. I'm just going to echo a little bit of what Councilmember Roper said. Northland has more than enough 2- and 3-story apartment buildings. They put more than enough stress on our first responders. Lord knows we don't need any more of them. Actually, we have the problem of not having anything at the other end of the housing spectrum here in North Glen. I'd really like to see as minimal as possible multifamily residential units. I'd like to see ownership rates high here. And I think that will help them make the area more desirable. And I'm going to echo something off Councilmember Nowicki here. I like that focal point being away from the rec center where all the kids are playing and things. So I'm not going with any one model. I'd just tell you the truth. I'd like to see less apartments because we have enough of them.
Yeah, just for my clarity, maybe everyone else understands already, but is it about ownership versus rental, or is it about a multifamily product versus a townhome product? Is there a preference on both of those issues, or?
I think I'm assuming the townhomes are going to be ownership, correct? Just want to make sure I understand that correctly.
I mean, there are instances of both, but yeah, usually.
I would figure in this market with the developers, that's what it would be. And I'd like to see even more of that, maybe protrude into, like on scenario one, into the orange area right there. Maybe even incorporate more of those.
Okay.
So I'd like to see ownership rate high.
Yeah.
We have more than enough rental properties in this city, and we don't need any more stress on our first responders.
Yeah. I have not asked Matt this question, so it may not even be feasible, but like a small condo building?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I just want to sort of understand the nature of the.
Yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Can I piggyback on that?
Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned the condo piece, because I did notice in one of the slides, it looked like 2016 is when condo just dropped off. can you say a little bit, so you mentioned a condo piece now, but it looks like condos like disappeared from the market. How would we kind of, right?
Construction defects.
So
Those previous, those condos that showed up there, in a lot of ways, they're sort of like fourplexes, and they kind of function somewhat like a townhome, but they were just condominiumized in terms of their ownership. Instead of a fee simple lot, it was a condo sort of fourplex.
Okay.
And so they are sort of, in my mind, very similar product to the townhomes. They were just categorized as condos as opposed to an attached product. Not necessarily what you would traditionally think of a condo, of sort of like a 4-story building that looks like an apartment but really is ownership units. That's not what was being produced. It was more sort of just a different flavor of townhome that happened to be condominiumized.
Okay.
And so in Colorado, you may know that there are challenges with condos around construction defects, and really the insurance premiums that you have to pay, or the developer has to pay to finance their building, makes it challenging to build condos, especially in locations that aren't like the most desirable, say Cherry Creek, downtown. And so there are a lot of efforts to try to change that, but it's still an issue.
Sure.
And so that's one thing to consider if we're thinking of like a 4 or 5 story condo building. That's going to be a lot more challenging than, say, a different sort of varieties of 2 or 3 story townhomes that might be condoed, just because that's the way it worked better to build it for the developer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Burns.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Okay, I have a lot of feelings. When I want to speak to the rest of my dais members, I'm hearing a lot of like, I want this, and that's great. That's what, we kind of want. But like, if we remember earlier in the presentation, like, let's just look at the percentage of residents by age. The average age that is growing is Gen Z and millennials. A study was released today. It takes the average person 27 years to save for a down payment. So these things that you want and the things that are reality aren't meshing. And the things that the market wants are also not meshing with our vision. So when we say things like, apartments don't equal crime. Poverty doesn't equal crime. I don't want us to be an exclusionary city. And so, like, having this dream white picket fence, this old retro view of the world is not real anymore. It's not real. Okay, I need to stop speaking. Thank you.
No, it's okay. I appreciate that perspective. Our Mayor Pro Tem is not here, but she sent forward some thoughts, and I assured her that I would share them. So here we go. She prefers scenario 1, and she's talking about feedback from residents around parking during events, and so highlighting the fact that scenario 1 has parking near the rec center is important. She's not for any rental products at all. She says she wants all for sale. Highlights construction defect legislation that's on the radar, could help get condos in there. Townhomes selling well. Had questions about infrastructure and what would that cost be. And then really preferring not to have big box names, but wanting little cafes, boutique shops, and having it be family and community oriented. So those are her highlights. I want to go to my notes really quickly. Scenario 1 spoke to me the most. Scenario 2, instantly, I don't know who sings the song. I know it's been covered, that whole pave paradise and put up a parking lot.
Yep.
That's what scenario 2 said to me instantly. And I was like, ooh, we can't do that to our city. So that didn't feel good. That was literally, it popped into my head immediately. And for scenario 3, I think, I heard the commercial in the back could be seen by the highway. I think we can put up a nice big sign right there. I just don't love having commercial tucked in the back there. That didn't appeal to me. So as far as that goes, and to Councilmember Burns' point, this is not what I want. This is me reacting based on lots of communication with residents over a few years' time, 5 or 6 at this point, thinking about what our residents are really wanting for this space. And one of the things that has come through multiple times is that sort of little teeny downtown. We're not looking for a whole downtown. We're looking for a quaint, community-oriented downtown. And we don't get that with scenario 2 because the commercial is facing Community Center Drive. And so that didn't match, I think, some of the conversations. And so I started going through a little combo of 1 and 3. So 2 did not speak to me at all. And I really do not believe we need a parking structure. I think that's a waste of space. So I recently experienced a pretty packed day at the theater, and I had to walk a little further. And so if we have a little more space closer to the rec center, I think that's great, but I don't think we need to just pave the entire thing because a good portion of the time that's going to be empty. And so I don't love that. I feel like it's a waste, and the cost of a structure, I think, just outweighs its purpose. So that's my opinion. But if you look at, and yeah, the focal point over there is great. So I had a thought for scenario 1 where instead of having that red box in the corner, doing more of an L shape that starts at the rec center, goes all the way down to the focal point, and then comes down adjacent to the,
A little bit.
yeah, so instead of a block in the corner, it's a little more of an L shape with, I would love to have more like pocket park spaces, greenery breaking up, as Councilmember Goff said. So it's not just lots of concrete in a row. I don't love the idea of putting up a ton of high rises. My concern is if the market is requiring it, can we be strategic about it? So if we need to get the number of units up in order to make this a feasible site, can we be strategic about where they are? And I mean, I sort of see it closer to Community Center Drive so that there's, a view. I don't know. We do have a nice view of the mountains from right here. But maybe that's not smart either. I don't want to overcorrect on the parking, right? We have a problem, but I don't want to overcorrect. And I think for me, it's the conversations that we've had about having a little downtown strip. And so looking at scenario 1 with the live work space, so that purple strip with the red on the other side could potentially activate that whole space as a cute little main street with the housing and the walkability and all of that. So scenario 1 spoke to me the most based on conversations that we've had. But then those were my ideas, like how can we increase cute little spaces, right? They don't have to be full-blown parks, but to have cute little pocket parks or, seating that goes all the way through it, making it a really community feel. And I don't love the tons of units. I don't believe, and you are the experts, you guys would have to tell us if it's a viable site for sale only. Doesn't seem to be. It seems like the market is asking that we have mix, right? That we have some products for sale and some for rent. And I do. Councilmember Burns, I completely agreed with you. I also was sort of tripped on the poverty does not equal crime. So just being very mindful of that. And we can also have apartments that are high-end. I mean, if that's going to depend too. I would love to find a way to put a Habitat build in here. I said it at the last meeting, and to find a way to have that, maybe a string of townhomes be partnering with Habitat for Humanity. I think that would echo our values as a city, so.
Great.
Those are my thoughts. Now that we've gone around once, we have more hands back up. So, Councilmember Goff.
Thank you, Mayor. Oh, I've never turned that off. Yeah, a couple of things that have come to mind in listening to the conversation, and I was actually going to say something about the, like, Habitat for Humanity or whatever. I know early on, we had talked about some kind of, like, rent-controlled, I know this is the wrong terminology, but something like that, low-income housing on this site, which now does not seem like it's going to be feasible. So something like a Habitat for Humanity, something that would be helpful so we can kind of have a more diverse population in this area. And then some more of, well, I guess let me ask this first. I think if I heard you right, earlier on you said something about the townhomes being 5 stories?
No.
Oh, okay, I misheard it then, okay.
Council person assumed that. I said there were probably 3 or 4 stories.
Okay, because, I mean, I was just trying to think, then, how skinny are they if they're going up that high? Okay, so I just wanted to clarify on that one. And then so I do think, I'm just thinking in terms of something like a townhome, and I know we do want to provide places for people to, so that they can afford to live, whether it's renting or whatever. But a lot of seniors who own homes, for example, myself, in this community would like to downsize, and they're probably looking for something they can own instead of rent. And there aren't a lot of those options out there either. And so then we're stuck in our house, and then no starter family can come in and live in our house because we're still in it. So I think if we could sort of think of some way to kind of move people through the different stages of home ownership, I think that would be really helpful. So to me, that's some of that at least is some kind of, owner-occupied housing there.
Okay.
And I think, yeah, that's it for me.
Okay. Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate, one of the benefits of partnering with Habitat is that they make home ownership a possibility. Mm-hmm. And residents get to work toward building their home and taking part, so. Councilmember Burns?
I just didn't put my hand down from before, but thank you. I think
I just took a bite of a
I've
cookie.
calmed myself down and I feel better. But yeah, I just really want to just have a perspective of like who could potentially be living here, the age of those people, and because Catherine, like you said, sorry, Councilmember Goff, you said, I would like to downsize. Sure, but the average home, as stated earlier, in North Glen is north of $500,000. You know what I mean? So how feasible, it'd be way more feasible for a young family to buy a townhome first, then move into your home. This is the new norm, right? Like, I think, like, we just need to, I talk about this all the time, but thinking forward, right? We need to be thinking 10 years in the future. This project won't be done until then, however many years in the future. I just think we need to, things feel good in the now, and that's great, but we just need to keep thinking forward. Thanks.
Councilmember Kondo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to respond to Councilmember Burns's concern about affordability. And it begs the question, are you working with Urban Land Institute by any chance to, as you are doing this assessment and kind of coming up with design here, I'm just kind of curious, how does ULI tie into all of this?
We're not working with them directly on this project, but Mark, Matt, and myself are all involved with ULI.
Okay. I was moved by your comment, and I went to Urban Land Institute. I actually participated in one of their workshops 2-3 months ago, and it was very insightful about developing urban areas. And so I went and found this publication, Overcoming Barriers to Affordable Housing in Colorado. Unfortunately, it's published October 2016, pre-pandemic. I don't know if there's anything more contemporary that might be helpful to inform us as a days. Do we need to do a land trust? Do we think about a land trust to provide more? It sounds like maybe you did. Okay, gotcha. So maybe that predated my time coming here. Or do we need to decide as a city that we need to subsidize? And that's a tough conversation. That is, I don't know if we, did the days have that conversation before I came on in 2022?
Well, it was, I'm sorry, it was in early discussions, like before the pandemic, that, and we had like, I don't know, at one point we even like had a little hotel and, stuff like that. And there was a section that we had marked off to do something like that.
Yeah. I just feel like, to kind of be responsive to your concern, is that, do we need to open the scope to make sure that as you're doing all of this brainstorming, that's part of the areas that you are considering looking at when you're developing your recommendation?
Yeah, we can continue.
And that was a deep thought question, I'm sorry, but.
We can dig into that more. I think a part of that is the form, which is really what kind of tonight's conversation is about. And we have given names to these colored blocks, right? So I appreciate the conversation and the thoughts about apartment versus condo versus multifamily, renter, owner, townhome. But ultimately, I think some of those pieces, to your point, are delivery methods, and sort of how much skin in the game does the city have, or is it purely a private endeavor ultimately? So we'll approach it from both angles, thinking about the product type, the product mix, and maybe have a little bit of variation still for you all to respond to in our next iteration, and debate, but then also work with Matt, and we can reach out to ULI and other good thinkers on this about additional delivery methods that, in addition to the habitat approach, may add extra layers to that sort of for accessibility, let's call it. Because just affordability sort of suggests it's going to be subsidized typically, right? Like the big A, affordable. It may not be, but I think there's other aspects that we can consider in terms of creating unique product mix, and then how is that delivered ultimately?
Can you speak? I mean, I think we have exhausted our questions and comments, but can you sort of, in closing, I think it's good to re-ground ourselves in the fact that we currently own this property, and we're throwing out all of these ideas, but then don't we ultimately give it to a developer? And is there a moment in which someone else can say, okay, well, that yellow block, I know you wanted it to look like this, but we tweaked it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've probably heard me say previously, the one thing I can guarantee is that what gets built ultimately is not going to look exactly like what we depict, even at the end of this process. But what we can do is provide some really clear guidance, determine which portions of the project is the city either mandating or even delivering itself in terms of public infrastructure, potentially, which does frame things quite a bit and shapes things. And then we can also create design standards and guidelines as well. So while it may not look exactly like or we're depicting, a piece of this could be studying those standards and requirements to ensure that it's of a certain quality, that it's meeting certain intent. So, for instance, I think usually when we think of design standards and guidelines, we think of the floor to ceiling height, how much of the frontage is transparent, windows versus an opaque surface. But it can also be related to building length, right? So you don't end up with a humongous block that's one building, no articulation, and it feels like, it feels like you're in downtown Chicago, a bad block in downtown Chicago, not with beautiful architecture. And so we want to do something that's of this place, and part of that can be setting those parameters, setting the expectations, and setting certain requirements of the developer team.
Okay. I think it's just good to remind ourselves, because we can really get in the weeds and say, no, I want, as Councilmember Burns says, I want to park on that corner, or I want the street to go one. It doesn't really matter. Like, we were giving you feedback on what you presented to us.
Understand.
And I know how you work. You took mad notes over there, and you're going to pull it together and come back. So thank you. Thank you for your time and your grace and patience with us.
Thank you all for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Looking forward to next time.
All right, next up, East 112th Ditch and Roadway Project Update. Director of Public Works, Sarah Borgers, will introduce this item.
Mayor and Council, it's good to be with you tonight. This is a topic that I know has been going on for quite some time, and I myself have gotten up to speed on it as much as I can. So we've got a group of people here tonight. We have Dr. Andrew Earls and Victoria Hennon from Right Water, who has done some modeling efforts and some alternatives analysis for us. We also have Andy Stewart here with Mile High Flood District. We're really happy to have their support on this project. And from a staff perspective, we have Tamara Moon, our environmental manager, and Pam Aker, our stormwater coordinator. So we got a whole group of people ready to answer questions. This is a little bit of a tough topic because the numbers did come in pretty high, but know that we did turn over as many rocks as we could think of to try and find alternative solutions around this. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Earls for him to go through their work.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and good evening, City Council members. It's nice to see many of you again, and really appreciate you all having us here before you. For the record, my name is Andrew Earls with Right Water Engineers, and we've been here a few times before to tell you about some of our technical analysis and some of the different ideas we've been working with. And tonight, we're really here to fill you in on some of the alternatives that we've analyzed and what we think is a good solution for moving forward for this corridor. And then after I talk, the city will speak a little bit about some of the financial ideas. I'll talk a little bit about phasing and some other ideas. So, and I'll try to probably have about 15 minutes of presenting and would be glad to answer questions too. So let me move on to the next slide here. Just as a reminder, as I said, we've been here a couple times before. I think we've had at least one or two presentations to you all and probably a work session to get some input from you. We've also had some meetings with the community, and those have been extremely important, and we've really appreciated the input that we've received from community members. The first one that we had was back in November of 2023, and that was really a session really to try and listen to the residents. You know, they had just flooded, at least many of them along the south side of East 112th over the summer of 2023. In some cases, a couple times there was flooding, especially into yards. The July 4th one damaged some homes, and so learning from the residents how they had been affected, you know, we'd been out there right afterwards looking at things, but hearing from them and also hearing from them about what they thought some of the problems were was really informative. We met with them again when we presented the interim measures that I'll tell you a little bit about tonight to get input on that idea. And at the same time, we also talked with some of them about different ideas for longer term solutions, which is what I'm really going to focus on here tonight. And really at a high level, you know, what a lot of this boils down to is trying to address capacity issues that exist at Irma and Larson and the ditch sections in between. And that's really the root cause of a lot of these issues. And if we can address those, then we'll be ahead of the game. And that's what our plan tries to show. So I want to start out by talking just briefly about the interim measures. I imagine any of you who have driven on East 112th have probably noticed these, and I think they were done quite nicely. These were done in fairly short order. The construction started in late April and was finished by early July. The protection was there even before early July. A lot of that was required just finishing work, putting up the guardrail and other things. But the way that this really works is this concrete curb that you can see through here. Actually, this may not point that well. On the left-hand side of the photo, let's do it that way, that is actually raised 10 inches. And if you look in kind of the foreground of the photo, you can see the existing curb is only 6 inches. And what that does is it adds another 4 inches. But it's not just 4 inches, it's 4 inches across that whole roadway section. And so that has really made a big difference. Thankfully, it wasn't tested by really hard precipitation this summer, but we believe that this would provide protection for those residents to the south for up to a 10-year event, if not a little bit more than that. Now, one thing to note there is that this will keep more water in the street. I mean, that's the intent of this. And so we did design this so that it would meet the overtopping requirements for a collector street. You know, there's certain maximum depths you want to have before something will overtop. And this is intended to limit it to 12 inches, which is the criterion. And so obviously if you get beyond that though, you can have some overtopping and there could be flooding in a larger event, but we also don't want the depths in the street to get more deep than that, because this area is an area that even when they get, you know, heavy rainfall already, there's some street flooding that happens. That will continue, but I do think that this is a vast improvement, especially for the residents living on the south side, and it meets the criteria for the street. These are just a couple more photos. The one on the left is looking kind of from the Nura property, the urban renewal property, and it's looking to the west. You know, some of those homes right along the left-hand side there that you see were the most heavily impacted in July 4th. And so it's nice to get this in place for them. And again, I think the guardrail is a nice addition too. When we got into it, we realized that there were some weird things about the existing guardrail going back a ways, and it was a nice upgrade to implement in conjunction. It just made sense to do both of those things at the same time. And that's also a big improvement down here to keep cars from flipping into these people's yards a little better. So again, I can't claim credit for the transportation part of it. Muller Engineering helped with that. And then on the right-hand side, what you're seeing is what we call a speed hump. That's entering the Nura property. You know, we didn't just want to push the water down to the street and then have it flow through that property and flood everything there. So this is actually designed to come up to that same height of 10 inches. It's designed with a bit of a milder slope. And I've driven my personal car over that without having a problem. I mean, I don't drive corners super fast, but at the same time, driving at a reasonable speed, you know, it definitely feels like a little bit of a raise up, but it's not like you're bottoming out when you make that turn. So I think the Muller helped do that. And you can see on the bottom part of that right-hand photo where the flood wall ties into it, or the raised curb that I'm referring to there. So, ongoing ditch maintenance has been another extremely important thing that's been going on here. You know, just to put this in perspective, if we look at the ditch, the photo on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side, a maintained ditch versus an unmaintained ditch, you know, you don't have to be an engineer like me to know that there's a big difference in how much flow can go through there. I can tell you from an engineering standpoint that it's at least a factor of 2. That photo on the right can carry at least twice as much water as the photo on the left can carry at least twice as much flow as the photo on the right. And so the ongoing maintenance is critical. And the good news is Mile High has funding set aside through this to do routinely inspections and removing vegetation and sediment as needed through 2025. North Glen is also, the city's committed to hiring a contractor. The Parks and Maintenance is going to mow as needed, and the city staff are going to inspect and monitor and call for this to be maintained either by Mile High Flood District or their own contractors when maintenance is needed. But this, really, I can't understate the importance of this, that keeping this thing maintained is really important for the resilience of this area and protection of it from flooding. So let me show you a map here, and this is really showing you, I want to explain this a little bit. This is what we're calling a 100-year inundation boundary. And I'm being really careful. The reason I'm not calling it a floodplain is because it's not a regulatory floodplain, right? There is not regulatory floodplain mapping in this area. That's extremely important because it means that the residents in this area could buy flood insurance if they want to without having to pay a premium for being in the floodplain. It is very inexpensive when you're not mapped in a floodplain, and none of these areas are mapped in a regulatory floodplain right now. But what this is showing you is the area along the corridor that we studied, that if you were to have a 100-year rainfall event, 2-hour storm, which is what we typically model here, these are the areas that would be flooded as of the condition of summer 2023. So before the interim measures were implemented, before anything we're talking about tonight is implemented, this is the area that is susceptible to flooding in that kind of event, which would be on average once in every 100 years. But another way to put it is that it has a 1% chance in any given year. So again, knowing the flood risk is good here, and this really provided the starting point for our analysis to say, okay, of the various things we can do, what effect is that going to have to shrink this floodplain or to try and take homes out of this floodplain that are in the floodplain? And so we looked at 3 different alternatives. The first alternative was to rely on the existing interim measures with one additional project to install curb on the south side of 112th from the intersection with Larson up to where the curb starts. That's just to address kind of a nuisance flooding issue from the street, but it would also help when the Larson culvert overtops. But that is essentially, do nothing more alternative. Maybe, spend another $100,000 on curbing and call it good. And, that has had big effects on the properties immediately on the south side of East 112th. But per this map I just showed you here, there are a lot of other areas, and those are not addressed by the interim measures. So really, in my opinion, and we'll talk about it a little more, but I don't think the interim measures provide the level of flood protection that this area needs. It protects things, up to about a 10-year level for now, but you get a big one, there's still going to be a lot of damages. Okay, the second one is the channel and culvert improvements. Pardon me, I've had a little congestion from asthma. But the channel and culvert improvements is what we've talked with you all about some before, and a lot of the residents had raised this issue. It's really a recognition that the culverts in Irma and Larson really act like choke points, and that really what this would do would increase the size of those culverts to levels at which they could convey a 100-year flow, and it would involve improving the channel upstream, downstream, and in between them to handle that same flow too. This alternative is the one that we think makes the most sense, and we'll get into some more details on this. And it is expensive. One thing is this alternative could be phased fairly easily, and I'll talk a little bit about that before I'm done here too. And then the third alternative, we just added some cost to this just for relative comparison. This was raised at a previous meeting we had with you, and I can't remember which one of the council members raised it, but it was about the potential to have future development along East 112th Avenue that could lead to a future roadway expansion. And so what we did for that is we priced out a box culvert for the whole length of it. I want to really emphasize when I show you that cost, and I will do it again, is that cost is really just for the box, right? It's not the road project. It's not everything else that goes with it. It is just putting in the box. And so when you see that number, which is the highest number I'll show you tonight, just realize that for the total project, it would be a lot more than that, and that it would have to be done in conjunction with another project. It's not a standalone project. It would have to happen with the road expansion. So, but it's something to keep in mind for the future, and it's nice to know what size box culvert you'll need when you do start planning a future road expansion and have some preliminary work on that. So I want to look a little bit at what the different alternatives do. And this can be a little bit of a confusing map, so let me try and break it down real quick. So the light blue is really the areas I'd previously shown you. That's what a 1% event would have done based on the summer 23 conditions. The purple hatching is what has changed with the implementation of the interim measures. And what you can see there is that it's taken all those homes out that were flooded just to the south of East 112th between Larson and Irma. There are some additional shallow flooding areas that you'll see further to the east of Irma. I want to emphasize that those are only on the order of an inch or two. Those are extremely shallow flooding depths, and we don't think they really pose a flood flood hazard. So if we look at that, that's where we are today with the interim measures. We've taken the areas that are blue but don't have the purple hatching on them out, but you can see we still got a whole lot of areas in there. Now, if we go with the recommended alternative that we're suggesting, it's basically shown in that red line, which is the alignment of the channel or for alternative 2, or the channel or the box culvert for alternative 3. That would essentially contain it all. Everything else goes away if you do that, and you have removed a whole lot of structures from the floodplain if you're able to pull that off either through alternative 2 or alternative 3. So I'm going to go into a little more detail on each of those, and then we can obviously circle back and let you all ask questions. So this is alternative 1, and really, as I mentioned before, this is pretty much already done. Cost about $660,000. I really want to emphasize that that was only the construction cost. There was a lot of analysis that went in before this. There was a lot of planning. There was a lot of engineering design. There was a lot of coordination that happened. So really, that is just the bare bones, the cost of construction. And it's good. I mean, that is really a good investment for what it's provided in terms of offering increased level of flood protection. And it'll do a really good job until you get a pretty big event, not quite a 100-year event, and then you could have problems again in those same areas that are protected now. The main addition we would have, and the reason we say this would cost more like $700,000 to $800,000 is because we would recommend putting in that 6-inch curb just on that upstream of Larson until you tie into where there's already an existing 6-inch curb. There's just a flush curb on that side right now, and it would just better contain flows in the street. That could also be done in conjunction with the street project if there was some street work around there in the future. Okay, this is alternative 2. This is a little more involved, and I'm going to start on the downstream end and kind of work my way up. The thing you need to keep in mind with this alternative is that we have to really start on the downstream end and work our way up, because as soon as we open up one of these culverts, we're sending more water downstream, and we don't want to create a flooding problem downstream, so we kind of have to build the capacity in working our way upstream, and I'll explain that when I get to the phasing. But we do think that, we'd work on this ditch downstream of Irma. That would be part of the first phase. And that would really involve taking that existing channel, and what we would do is we'd put a concrete line bottom in it. Typically for natural channels, we don't like concrete line bottoms. We like natural cobble bottoms and things. But this isn't a natural channel. This is truly is a ditch. And what a concrete bottom would do is it would help with a lot of the growth of cattails as long as you keep sediment cleaned out of it. And if we can design it just about wide enough for a bobcat or a skid steer to drive down it, that'll make it even easier for it to be maintained. And so that would improve the hydraulic capacity because it's a little smoother than the type of bottom we have right now, but it would also make it a lot more maintainable. And you have to keep in mind the maintenance is going to be, $14 million or $15 million might be a big cost now, but maintenance is going to be an ongoing cost forever for this area. So whatever you can do as a part of this design to make it more maintainable will save the city money in the long run. So that's just something to point out. We probably would have to do some retaining walls in a few of the areas on this lower channel, and I think also in the lower area, right down near the bend where it turns at the railroad, we'd probably need to have a flood wall and maybe a flap gate so we don't back up water into the neighborhoods below there. I think that's a problem that already may occur some now, but that's something we could also address as a part of this. That would be something in a more advanced stage of design, but it's something we're aware of, and we don't want to exacerbate that problem. As a matter of fact, we went out of our way not to. So another part of the first phase would be replacing the Irma culvert. That is the worst bottleneck out there, and that will lead to immediate improvements. But to do that, we also need to take care of the channel downstream so that that has adequate capacity. One of the big issues with Irma is that there is a storm drain line that runs underneath that box culvert, and that makes it challenging to lower it. We looked at a few alternatives. One of them, we looked at running the Irma storm drain into it and then running it downstream. We found that took too much water downstream and made flooding worse downstream, so we didn't want to do that. The alternative we currently think could work fairly well is to actually lower that storm drain under Irma and bring it down, so that we basically lower the storm drain and then lower the box culvert above it, and we think that could work. One other thing that may bear analysis before, at the next stage of design before you make a final decision is that the last thing we can evaluate is running the Irma storm drain in one side of that box and out the other side. Now that's really complicated hydraulics. It's kind of messy. You know, you have 4-directional flow. It all mixes in the middle. You have to do some kind of fancy modeling to figure out what's going to happen. But, you know, if something like that could save the city $1 million and having to lower a storm drain, it'd be worth doing the analysis to find out if that could work. So again, that may be a third alternative to consider there. But at least so far, we've evaluated enough to know that we think we can lower it if we need to. We can get it low enough to increase the capacity of that crossing to a 100-year level. So continuing upstream, you know, the next phase would be to improve the channel, the Larson culvert in the channel between Larson and Irma. That's kind of a flat section of the channel. It has the least capacity of any of the sections of channel. And so we would basically be steepening that just a little bit, taking advantage of trying to get a little bit of depression at the inlet to the culvert on Irma, and then also trying to just keep a good velocity through there to keep sediment moving so we don't have aggradation. And again, we'd use the concrete line channel there too. And then finally, upstream of Larson would be a third phase, and that's where you'd put in just channel improvements, reestablish some of those drop structures that have blown out, repair bank erosion and all of that kind of stuff. You know, this channel hasn't been touched since the early 1980s, and it really is falling apart in a lot of places, as those of you who've walked along it I'm sure have seen. So alternative 3, I won't really spend, and the cost of that alternative was approximately $16 million. Again, I'll speak how we can break that down into phases. And alternative 3, I won't go into a lot of details, but in general, you know, a 6x10 reinforced concrete box could do the trick here. You know, the one thing I would say with this alternative is that we would basically make it so that it would work with the culverts. So if you do alternative 2 now, and you put in new box culverts there, you're not going to come back when you do this road expansion and rip them out. We're going to make them big enough so that you just basically build the culvert onto either end of it. So so that's just a consideration for, you know, not boxing ourselves in the future, is making sure we have the capacity we need. So to break down alternative 2 just a little bit, and I'm sorry for the way these, I didn't realize the text was kind of over printing itself, so I hope your copy in your packet maybe is a little clearer. But I wanted to give just a few of the highlights of what alternative 2 does. And, you know, really what it comes down to is that it's going to remove quite a few structures from the floodplain. You know, if we look at summer of 2023 conditions and we look at the 100-year inundation, there were about 99 structures in there. We've removed 13 of them with the interim measures, and if you go with alternative 2, you would end up removing 86 more. So you'd virtually be left with no structures left in this floodplain, which would be wonderful for the residents, and it would also mean a lot for the community, because this is an area where when you have a flood, you're going to have to respond. There are going to be damages. You know, it would be a real improvement for this area. You know, in terms of the area, it's also pretty big. You know, because the water spreads a little more with the interim measures and that very shallow flooding, the area actually goes up a little bit with that, although again, it's a matter of flooding of inches. But with implementation of the recommended alternative, 2 or 3 would have essentially the same effect. You know, you'd be left with a floodplain that was entirely contained in the channel, going from about 28 acres down to about 2.3 acres in the future. So those are real measurable benefits of what you'd get for funding a project for $16 million. Let's look a little bit about how this could be phased. I talked about this just a little bit earlier, about how we'd want to start downstream and work our way up. Definitely open to suggestions, but you know, when we break this down, and these costs are include engineering, planning, construction, you know, getting permits, all of those sorts of things. So these truly are meant to be construction estimates. And obviously, probably a lot of you know construction costs are pretty volatile these days, so that things can change, but these are good estimates using numbers from 2023 and 2024, representing current pricing or more current pricing. So phase 1 would be, again, from the bend in the channel up to Irma. It would also include the Irma culvert. One of the extra expenses there is lowering that storm drain underneath Irma. That's an area where you might be able to have some savings, as I was mentioning, just running it in one side and out the other and kind of having a 4-way junction. Again, that need to be evaluated hydraulically, but that could reduce the cost there some. Phase 2 would be Larson, the channel between Larson, Irma, and the Larson culvert. Again, the Larson, I mean, if you go back to that floodplain map I showed, you know, Irma's been a big problem, but Larson would be a big problem and a bigger flood and could flood a lot of properties. So that's another one, phase 2. And then phase 3 would carry it up to Washington Street and would mainly be channel improvements. So, you know, talking about funding, I think, hang on. Yeah, these are just, let's see, did I get ahead of myself? No, yeah, we have another slide that kind of breaks down the funding a little bit. Hang on. So really, did you want to address this slide? Or, I didn't know if I was, is that at the end? Okay.
Yep.
I didn't realize I had a couple slides left.
You're good, you're good. All right, so when we see these numbers, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is how are we going to pay for this? The alternative to, as Dr. Earls mentioned, is $16 million. For context, our Stormwater Enterprise Fund has an annual revenue of $430,000. So there's a gap there when you look at that. Staff has made a request through congressionally directed spending through a number of avenues, made a request for $14 million. We recently learned that that was not funded. There was another request that was reduced to $1 million, and the outcome of that we won't know until the springtime. We have been looking around at what other funding options there are available. Many of them are not large enough to fund something of this magnitude. Those that are large enough and have the capacity for it are highly competitive. And so staff is recommending hiring a consultant to help connect us with appropriate funding sources and also help us complete that grant funding so that we can be as successful as possible when we move forward with this project. Project timeline. So I really wanted to put this in here for context. I think there is, for all of us, a desire for this to get done yesterday. It does take time to do a project. So the work that Right Water has been doing is a modeling effort. It's an alternatives analysis. It's not an engineering design. An engineering design takes time, and so there's an RFP process to hire an engineer that takes 3 to 4 months. Developing construction documents, but with an engineering firm is another 6 to 9. Bid process to construction, 3 to 4 months, and then the actual construction time itself. So this is where we struggle in Public Works a little bit, because sometimes it looks like nothing's happening. There's actually a lot happening. It's just not actually digging in the dirt and making real world stuff happen. So project timeline, it may be a while before we're able to move forward with something, and that would be after we're able to procure funding. So our next steps, we want to check back in with you. We know that this is an important topic that you've had and been talking about with the community. So next quarter, we would like to come back with an analysis from the consultant that we hire, make sure that we're staying on track and doing what council wants us to be, the direction council wants us to head. We'll also have the results of our system-wide stormwater analysis. So this is one area. There are potentially other areas that we need to address as well. And we want to incorporate that into whatever grant funding that we're looking for. And then continued communication with residents, of course. All right, so that's the presentation part. I have a sneaking suspicion you have questions, so we're happy to take those.
All right, Councilmember Kondo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. If you could go back to slide 6 and 7, I'm just curious. In those pictures, I see some straw wattle against the chain link fence. Is that also part of the facilities, if you will, for interim flood control? Is that intended to be permanent?
No, the straw wattles were there, and as a part, hang on, just let me get back to the slide you're speaking of.
Yep,
right there. No, those yeah, and you can see some in that picture too. Those big reds are what we call those.
Yep.
But no, those are just temporary erosion controls until that dirt area that's between the curb and those becomes established, and then those can be removed. Sometimes people leave them in place. I mean, they're, just straw with some netting on them. But, I think typically after you get vegetation or that area is stabilized, the practice would normally be to remove those.
Okay, understand. And then on slide 8, it says that North Glen is on the hook for future ditch maintenance. I was under the impression that the city basically has up until the edge of the ditch in terms of trimming vegetation and whatnot, and that Mile High Flood District is on, they have the onus for clearing the cattails and all the other sediments in the ditch itself.
I think this is a question for Andy Stewart.
Are we taking on that onus?
Hey, all right. Thank you.
And
Thank you guys
I
for
don't
having
mean
me.
onus in a bad way. Are we taking on that responsibility?
For the ditch maintenance?
Yes.
So the ditch maintenance, the district does take on responsibility for ditch maintenance and ongoing ditch maintenance. We do that through an annual work request process. So every fall, all the local municipalities within Adams County put in their work request. So since this is obviously North Glen's top priority, it's going to be an ongoing request made to the district. So we set aside funds to get in there and clear out the cattails within kind of the main channel section. Same thing with like up on the banks. Pam and Tammy have also secured a contractor to essentially do additional mowing as they see fit. And that could be outside the main channel where the cattails are typically growing.
Okay, understand. And if you could stay there, one follow-up question. So we're talking about alternative two. I feel like I'm in court or something. We're talking about alternative two. So if we're talking about creating a concrete bottom sort of thing wide enough for a bobcat, is that, from your perspective, given that you are going to be clearing the ditch, is that the ideal configuration that you would like to see?
Yeah, well, this is a ditch, and so ideal is not going to always fit into a box, let's just say. Given the circumstances with this particular facility, what Andrew Earls essentially is saying is like, concrete bottoms isn't a natural approach. We'd love to implement that whenever we can from an environmental standpoint, but for this particular instance, doing a concrete bottom will reduce maintenance. And I say maintenance as it relates to the cattails. So being able to get a bobcat down in there and just essentially scoop out the vegetation and the sediment accumulation on an annual basis would be cheaper than going with a natural approach where the cattails are going to be more expensive.
Okay, understand. And,
Yeah.
and you mentioned environmental considerations. So is that also another thing, that there would have to be a environmental study or anything like that, or?
So we'll take a look at this. We have our environmental manager at the Mile High Flood District. We'll take a look at this. We haven't taken that step with this particular study as it relates to a 404 permit and what the Corps would essentially require here. That's a conversation that happens once we come to them with a plan. So we've devised our set of alternatives of what we would like to entertain here. Once we kind of land on a recommended plan and approach moving forward, at that point, we'll kind of enlist what would the Corps stipulations be. You know, there's different types of 404 permitting. When you're doing maintenance, you know, the activities are covered under, those things are fine to do, like what we've done over the last couple of years as far as the ditch maintenance. But long-term solutions, we'd have to permit that through the Corps and make sure that we are understanding any regulatory requirements they're going to put on this particular project.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I would just add that there is the potential that the Corps could find that this is not a jurisdictional feature. I mean, it's been ditched. It is a feature that was constructed in an upland area. Obviously, we have the mapping. So again, Andy's right. This comes at a later stage, but I wouldn't necessarily just assume that this is a feature that you'd have to get a 404 permit for, because I think it's pretty likely that you'd find that it's not jurisdictional.
And just for our audience, when you refer to the Corps, are you referring to the Army Corps of
Yeah, United
Engineers?
States Army Corps of Engineers. They regulate, implement Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So yeah, sorry to start talking in jargon all
No,
of a
no, I'm a
sudden.
Navy guy, so when you started talking about Corps, I figured it was the Army Corps.
Yeah, not the
Although the
Marine Corps.
Navy is the better service.
Councilmember Burns.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So Director Borgers, thank you so much for this. I'm very excited to hear what the consultants say in first quarter. Are y'all also working and talking with NURA, because, you know, we have that property on the corner? What are they thinking? What's the vibe there? And how is that going to play into all of this?
That is an excellent question, and it is not a conversation that I'm aware has been had specifically. I'm eyeing Heather here to see if I've missed something.
You haven't, Director Borgers. Allison Modine is aware of the situation, and we've had some initial internal conversation. NURA does own that property. They are moving forward with demolition of the two structures. I believe Director Modine provided council that update last week. In terms of doing anything more, as if, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I'm sensing you might be asking, well, could we potentially need this property for improvements. That hasn't come up in terms of the analysis, so I think part of what we need to figure out is the alternative that you see that's recommending, if we're able to secure the funding, is what you see in front of you. If we're not able to secure that funding and the exercise is to go back up to the drawing board and look at other options, that's a potential conversation to be had, but premature at this point.
Okay, because I was also thinking too, just from a real estate standpoint, you know, how easy is that gonna be to sell? If we don't do, like, I feel like it's almost like cart and horse, horse and cart at this moment, with that. Even though it's not a floodplain, not a floodplain. Thank you.
On the Nura property? Yeah, so, you know, we did speak with Allison, with Nura, and so one thing to consider is like when they're putting out RFPs to potentially redevelop that site, the consideration or stipulations that would want to be disclosed in that situation is as you remember that asphalt berm going into the parking lot, essentially that whole site kind of needs to be elevated in that nature. Structures, anything built below that is just not going to be well. So it needs to be a thoughtful design for that, what they ultimately want to accomplish there. So, I mean, taking a look at really when they release that RFP of what they would need to do from the city's perspective, not saying that site couldn't be utilized for drainage purposes, that decision could be made by you guys. That's just not something that was entertained as the current trajectory with what I understood from Nura was that they do want to sell it off at some point.
Thank you.
So I went back to the next steps slide because I know one of the most frustrating parts of the process is the cost of all of these great ideas that you have, right? And we're pretty disappointed that the funding sources that we were chasing did not come through because this is a priority for us. However, the money is the biggest obstacle right now. And I think that's disappointing. And what's also can be super frustrating to council, but more importantly residents, is that all of governmental budgeting takes forever. You know, everyone budgets a year out, so money ends up being earmarked and spent on other things, and it takes a really long time to work through that process. And that's not a good answer for the people that live there, right? So I guess what I'm wondering, so when I go to the next steps, we're gonna check in again in the first quarter, which is great. We're gonna get some more information, which I so appreciate. Continuing to communicate with residents is also nice. Is there any action step that we can afford now? Like looking back at some of the smaller ones, if we stair step it in some way, do we have a budget to do anything now?
So I think the interim measures were kind of that like big effort of like, we've got people who are dealing with an issue right now. What can we do in 2024 to make that happen? And so that was about $600,000 in a fund that doesn't have a lot of wiggle room in it. And so it's a tough situation for those residents. I can only imagine if they need assistance with helping to locate flood insurance, something like that, that's a kind of a low-cost thing that staff could help them with if they need that help and they are interested. That's something that we could certainly offer.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate the heads up. Oh, Councilmember Kondo has his hand up again.
Well, I think you're looking for concurrence about hiring a grant consultant, and I forgot to mention this. I would be in support of that.
Great.
Okay. Yes, thank
Excellent.
you.
We will
Yeah,
get
we
started on
need to
that.
find the money for sure.
Mhm.
And we also, I mean, my push, which I know you're gonna do, I know we're all gonna do it, But I think just a commitment to our residents that we don't lose this project and we don't let it go in the meantime, that we continue to keep it a priority.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. All right, those were our 2 items for our study session. I'm going to adjourn the study session. I will now call to order the special city council meeting of December 2nd, 2024. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Leidy.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lukeman Haramasa is absent. Councilmember Burns. Here. Councilmember Jaramillo is absent. Councilmember Kondo.
Here.
Councilmember Roper.
Here.
Councilmember Goff.
Here.
Councilmember Nowicki. Here. Councilmember Walker.
Here.
I will entertain a motion that the city hold an executive session pursuant to Section 4.5A of the City of North Glen Home Rule Charter for personnel matters regarding council appointee evaluations.
So moved.
Second.
Please open the vote.
The vote is open.
Please vote.
And Councilmember Roper, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I will close that vote, and the motion to meet in executive session passes unanimously.
We will adjourn to the executive session.